Hello, everybody out there. I'm George Gruen, reporting from the Gruen Guitars Library Room, Nashville, Tennessee, July 22nd, 2022, for our weekly question and answer session. As usual, it may seem to be a weird world out there, but the guitar market is surprisingly resilient and healthy. There's a strong demand for fine vintage guitars. If anything, more than we can easily find. There's also a very strong demand for high quality new guitars. And we feel fortunate for that because the new guitars today from most major manufacturers are some of the best in the past 50 years or more. The fact is, the golden era, true collectible vintage still are highly collectible. And in the case of electric rock and roll guitars, and flat top acoustics are bringing record money. Banjos and mandolins are still somewhat off their absolute peak, but are rising to the point where, for example, Lohr signed F5 mandolins that had peaked as far back as late 06 or early 07 and then fell, are now selling quite well. Again, the prices have been readjusted a bit, but for a period of several years, they simply weren't moving. And the fact is that in the past 6 months, we have sold 3 Lohr signed 1924 F5 mandolins, and just about in the past week ago, we sold a July 9, 1923 signature date F5, signature date by Lohr, same day as Bill Monroe's mandolin, and that sold. So we still have one 1931 Fern pattern F5 mandolin for sale, but the point is they're selling. And the market overall remains strong. There is a considerable backlog of orders, back-ordered instruments with some of the major companies, Martin, Fender, Taylor, Gibson, etc. But we just got in several pallet loads of new Martins in the past week. And some of those have gotten in to the point, so just yesterday late afternoon, where we haven't even gotten them out of the boxes yet to catalog them, but they'll be on our website next week. And we have a very good selection. So I'm well pleased with that. There was an interesting article in the Wall Street Journal. It was a Saturday, Sunday, July 16 and 17 issue, because they do just one weekend issue, but anyway, how modern art was sold. And basically, it's interesting to point out that Van Gogh, a lot of French Impressionists, Picasso, in the early 1900s and late 1800s, that stuff wasn't selling very well at all. Van Gogh essentially died penniless. And early on, Picasso paintings were not bringing big money. But the Museum of Modern Art in New York and its principal supporters did quite a bit of marketing work, and Picasso himself was a good marketing man. But even as during World War I, that period, these things were still not really bringing big money. In 1913, the Art Institute of Chicago students burned Bach Patisse paintings in effigy led a supposed ritual execution of an effigy of Picasso. It wasn't really accepted well. And it's interesting how, in the case of the art, styles and public perception has changed so that, of course, now they're bringing huge money. And one of the real trendsetters was when Sotheby's had a sunflower painting, supposedly by Van Gogh. It had been certified by a number of experts as being real, and it brought $80 million, and nothing had ever brought that much before, and it set a new world record and created a frenzy. And not long afterward, the buyer had more testing done with more modern techniques of forensics, and they found that there were pigments in there and paints that could not possibly have been from that era. Sotheby's had to refund the money, but it still set a precedent that had it been real, that it would have brought that kind of money. And today, of course, there are numerous paintings that have already sold for $100 million plus. And some of those paintings are actually not as rare as a goodly number of the musical instruments we sell. Even Stradivari violins are not as rare as, for example, a pre-World War II D45 or a pre-World War II 000 or OM45 or even a 0045. There are instruments which today are some of the absolute prime guitar collector items that still are selling for a very small fraction of what a Stradivari violin or a Guarneri violin would, and even those are selling for a very small fraction of sometimes what even a not so great Picasso painting will bring. It's when Picassos are now routinely bringing $50 million or more, and sometimes $100 million or more. There are no guitars that have come anywhere remotely near that. So, for example, when Kurt Cobain's Martin D18E from '59 brought $6.1 million. This is pretty well a record for any guitar, but that price in the art world is commonplace for paintings that are even not all that special, where you can go to some museums and see rooms filled with Van Gogh paintings, or go to the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, and they got plenty of them. That doesn't mean they're a commonplace item that just anybody can own, but the point is they're not as rare as many of the guitars that we deal in on a fairly routine basis. That's true of even Sunburst Les Pauls, or some guitars like a '59 ES335. If you look at the production records, they're actually every bit as rare, if not more, than a Sunburst Les Paul of the same age. They cost a bit more when they were new than the Les Paul did. They have the same wiring harness, the same pickups and everything else that in their electronics and hardware. It's essentially the same. The body is different, obviously. The neck is a bit different, but they weren't less expensive to build. If anything, they were more labor intensive to produce that semi-hollow guitar. And they're still selling today for a fraction as much as a Sunburst Les Paul that cost less when it was new, but the price is up and it's heading upward more, and it has plenty of room. Guitars typically aren't being bought in quite the same world of buyers as the art patrons, but when John Monteleone's guitars were on display at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York a few years ago, along with two other Italian-American New York makers, John D'Angelico and Jimmy D'Acquisto, ever since. Many of the people, in fact, if anything, now a majority of the people buying a new Model Leon guitar are art patrons rather than the people we typically have associated with being guitar collectors. They've crossed over into a different market and into a market with people who will pay more. His Four Seasons quartet of guitars that showed spring, summer, fall, winter theme as a quartet of instruments with different ornamentation sold for considerable money, more than any other modern guitar builder has ever gotten. And the patron donated them after buying them for big money, donated them to the museum. So it puts them in a different context. At any rate, I'm not claiming that everything we have now is necessarily heading that direction, but we are seeing a new group of buyers who are different in their demographics, different in their basic approach than what we have been dealing with typically in the past. So where that will go, I do not know. We could ask the Magic 8 Ball here. Will the market be heavily influenced by a new group of people more akin to the art patrons than musicians? Will that money drastically impact the market? Yes or no? Well, let's see what the Magic 8 Ball has to say. The Magic 8 Ball says, reading the Magic 8 Ball. Try it again to read this one. It's not legible. Strange. Oh, I can see here. There is, it says yes, but some of it's illegible. So I'm going to try it again and see if the Magic 8 Ball comes up with anything else. It might be more legible. Seems to me that the Magic 8 Ball is having trouble answering. I can't easily read it. Outlook now is says the outlook now is just a guess. Well, that's even the Magic 8 Ball doesn't have the answer for us today. So I'll probably have to go on to something else. Anyway, I do have a couple of guitars, actually a trio of guitars I'd like to show that is an example, these are an example of a pair of makers that are now viewed as interesting. They're historically interesting as boutique guitars and as good guitars. This is a 1986 O size 12 fret with style 42 ornamentation by Wayne Henderson. Brazilian rosewood back and sides. And 86 Adirondack spruce, where red spruce was not so readily available. This one is Sitka. I remember back when I was affiliated with Guild in 86 through 88, I was on their board of directors, and I was their executive vice president of research and development and artist relations. And I tried getting some red spruce to make a few experimental guitars, and we had difficulty finding any commercially available at all. We finally found somebody who had a few wedges of it, and it was wide grained and wavy, not very pretty looking at all, but it was enough to make 4 guitars as an experiment. And the red spruce, even though the grain was almost, I'd have to say it was almost ugly, it was structurally stable and sounded remarkably better than any of the Sitka spruce that they had, but we couldn't get enough of it to consider making a model like that. Today, there's quite a few makers using red spruce, and I'd have to say that I was certainly one who was pushing Martin and others to do it. And the word spread, and today there's quite a few guitars being made with red spruce. But at any rate, this is a Henderson from 1986. I first met Wayne in 1965. He was quite a good builder then. By 86, his skills were extremely good. And this is a really fine guitar. It's one of the better sounding Hendersons I've ever had. And it is priced accordingly. It's $40,000. But it is a fine instrument. Another boutique maker, John Graven, worked at my shop. This one was made in 1977. This was shortly after he went independent. He'd worked for me from the early 70s right on through into 76. And then I moved out of 111 4th Avenue North. He rented that building, which I had just vacated, set up making guitars. And this guitar was made in that building, 111 4th Avenue North, Nashville. And it was right around the corner from my newer building at that time, which was at 410 Broadway. But this is Brazilian rosewood, and it would be Sitka spruce, because at that time we couldn't have found any other good spruce. It's carving on the heel of the neck, abalone top trim, cutaway, and this is a quadruple O size cutaway. Because even that far back, I was very into quadruple O size guitars that encouraged John to make them. This one's priced at $12,500, which has beautifully figured Brazilian rosewood. And John is now pretty much semi-retired from building as of recently, but he is located in Oregon. He's noted for making some very fine quality instruments. Another one, also by John Graven. This was maple back in size, 16 inches wide, and it's more the shape of a Gibson Everly Brothers or J185. This would also be a Sitka spruce top. And this was made in Nashville, Indiana. He had moved from Nashville, Tennessee to Nashville, Indiana, which interestingly enough in Brown County, Indiana, they have a topography that, you know, a lot of people think of Indiana as being flat as a pancake, agricultural, but Brown County, Indiana, which is also where Bill Monroe's Bluegrass Bean Blossom Festival was held. Looks remarkably like Tennessee. It's hilly, and the topography and geology of the area is very different than anywhere else in Indiana. But this is in good condition, handmade in Nashville, Indiana. And this one was owned by Jeff Hanna of the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band, one of the founding members. It's priced at $8,000. And on both of those Graven guitars, those prices are a relative bargain compared to what he would charge today or charged in recent years to build one. His new instruments were bringing very considerably more than that. So those are actually priced where they are quite a good deal compared to what he or other makers of similar talent are charging for hand-built guitars. We have some listener questions that have come in, but we could use more. So if anybody is listening right now and wishes to submit a question, please do, because I definitely can use more. We have a question from Paul. Can you comment on Roger Rossmeisel's involvement with Fender and the instruments that he designed or part designed for the company, in particular the LTD and Montego models, which were full depth acoustic archtop models. The case of the LTD, those had a floating pickup, and the Montego had more the CES type with the pickups built in, but they had designs very much like the guitars that Rossmeisel was involved with that were made in Germany, Roger brand, but early on in the 50s and early 60s, he had worked with Semi Mosley, and some of his type carving patterns influenced Mosley for Mosrite guitars. And later he worked for Fender, and he was involved with those models mentioned. And the LTD was the most expensive model made by Fender at that time. It did not sell in big quantity, but essentially it really didn't look, sound, or feel like a Fender guitar. It was more of a jazz design. But also, I guess, he had worked for Rickenbacker. So first with Mosley at Mosrite, then with Rickenbacker. And the Rickenbacker models, like the 381, with a very distinct, very prominent carved top pattern, those were also Rossmeisel designs. So he had an involvement with Mosrite, with Rickenbacker, and then with Fender, after which he went back to Germany. But the point is, he was actually quite an influential person in the history of California makers, because what's in common again with Mosrite, Rickenbacker, and Fender was that they were all California companies that were, over a period of over a decade, had significant input and influence from Roger Rossmeisel. And so you can find, in addition to those builders, you'll find guitars actually made in Germany, Roger brand, that look remarkably similar to the Fender LTD, with body shapes virtually the same. So interesting, something you can read up more on. We have a question from Oscar. what do you think about the fretboard radius change on the Stratocaster? When I see a Strat made before 1980, they look more balanced, but also smaller. Is it just an impression? And what is your opinion on the change? How did this idea come upon? Classical and older guitars used to have much larger fretboards. I personally prefer having a wide fretboard, but I feel like tuning stability is better on Fender guitars. Well, what I can't, some of that I'm not quite sure I understand the question, but what I do know is that the fretboard radius changed. The early Fenders have a 7 1/4 inch radius. And after 1980, the typical radius was 9 1/2 inches. To do a good setup job on the 7 1/4 inch radius requires more skill. It's more difficult to set it up well for string bending. And for people who are very into string bending technique, those folks typically prefer the 9 1/2 inch radius. And from the technician's point of view, it's easier to set it up. And definitely if you're doing string bending all the way across the board, is the way some of these guys doing just radical string bending, it's easier. But again, it can be done very well either way. But from the technician's point of view, it's easier to work on the 9 1/2. And from the player's point of view, it depends very much on your personal preference and your particular technique and touch. But today, the more standard radius is 9 1/2. But if you're getting custom shop, you can get a variety of different radius patterns. And Fender custom shop instruments, just by virtue of the name, they're custom. Well, you can get what you order, and you can do an excellent job either way. Fender, even early on, had A, B, and C neck widths, but the B was standard, the A was narrow, the C was wider. And this was available also on basses. But the vast majority shipped were B. But the other point to mention is that on the really early stuff, prior to CNC equipment, there was certainly mechanization, but there was more variability. And when things had to be hand guided, you're not necessarily going to get the thickness or the width precise to just a few thousandths of an inch. It can vary. And in feel of the neck, the difference in width of even 1/16 of an inch can really matter. Some of our special design Gruen model Martins mostly feature the 1 3/4 inch nut width now, but Martin standard from late, or actually after the first quarter of 39 until quite recently, their standard width was 1 11/16 at the nut on 14 fret guitars, whereas prior to that time, the 14 fret necks from late 29 through the first quarter of 30, from late 1929 to the first quarter of 1939, were 1 3/4. Now they're back to 1 3/4 on most of the Martin models, unless they're special order. But the point is, my customers feel the difference on some that we do to 1 13/16 wide on some of the 12 fret models, whereas most of ours still are 1 3/4. Is on the 12 fret quadruple O's. Some of the people who played them noted that they're 1 in 13. A few say it's a little wide feeling to them, and then others say, oh, that's perfect, that they prefer it. The point is they can feel the difference. So while a 16th of an inch seems like it wouldn't be much, people do feel it. On the other hand, scale length, triple O Martins with 14 fret today are typically a 24.9 scale, whereas the OM models and the D models are 25.4. And that's not as easy to feel. Some people claim they can feel it very much, but frankly, my experience is that people notice a 16th of an inch in nut width more than they notice that ½ inch in scale length. So the human hand and brain process sometimes, though, a remarkably small difference where it feels quite different. And people do have preferences. We have a question from John. Considering that you were able to turn a passion for guitars into a very successful business as well as a lifelong hobby as a collector, what factors caused you to become so interested in the guitar back in the 1960s when you were a college student at University of Chicago? Well, one, the folk boom was in full swing. I had friends in high school who were very into it and who were good players and would talk about their instruments. And this continued onward at college. They had a very active folklore society. And I found that the instruments were great pieces of art. They were interesting to me. I heard my friends talking about them. And I could look at them, and although my background was in zoology, particularly reptiles, herpetology, I could look at the instruments and see that the observational skills looking at an instrument to figure out what it is were basically the exact same skills that go into being a zoological taxonomist, where the things fit into the Linnaean taxonomic order of genus or family, genus, species, subspecies. And you can look at the scale patterns and other features on a snake or lizard or turtles, crocodilians, whatever. And you could use the same observational skills and categorization classification skills. The guitars interested me as great pieces of art. They weren't exciting yet as an investment because they weren't bringing big money at that time. It's like I mentioned earlier on, where people turned down Picasso paintings for under $50 back in the early 1900s. Nah, I didn't like it. Didn't see it as being worth having. Well, things that today would bring millions were being turned down at $50. Well, the guitars weren't big money at the time, but they were certainly interesting. I could see and hear that they were better than the new ones. They sounded better, they looked better, they felt better, they were just far more beautiful. It just had oozed soul and personality in a way that the new ones did not. And keep in mind that the quality of the new ones was already going downhill on the acoustics and on the electrics while I was in college, because my first freshman year of college was 1963. But even by late 64, and certainly during 1965 in particular, quality went downhill quite rapidly for Fender and Gibson. There was management change. And even at Martin, quality was being downgraded. Now, today, those same companies are making much better guitars than they did even in the late 60s. And these days, I still have to keep in mind that I've been in business for 52 years and 7 months, almost 8 months now. And a lot has changed. But a guitar, which was as old in 1970 as a 1970 guitar is now, would have been made in 1918. Because back then, a 30-year-old guitar was 1940 January. And when I opened up the store, a 1918 guitar in January of 70, a 1918 guitar was January of 1918. And most guitars, all of the Martins weren't yet steel string. They were gut string guitars, and they weren't producing dreadnoughts. And there were no electric guitars, and the F5 mandolin hadn't yet been invented, and neither had the Mastertone banjo. So today, when a lot of folks come in and they tell me they want a vintage instrument, and I find that their definition of vintage means 1990, well, a 1990 guitar today is 32 years old. And you know, I opened up my store, pre-World War II guitar would be in many cases no older than a 1990 guitar is right now, but we don't think of a 1990 guitar as being a vintage instrument. But back then we knew it was, because it was fundamentally different from the new ones. And it's better to use the term collectible and golden era, because the golden era hasn't necessarily changed, but it was more years ago. But we're also in a new era that, by golly, the new ones right now are better than the stuff of 50 years ago. And what will they be worth 20 years from now? Well, I can't answer that. The crystal ball, well, at least the 8-ball, seems to be malfunctioning here. I have to get me a new 8-ball. This thing is just giving illegible results. I don't know what happened to it. I have to go back to my crystal ball. See, it doesn't have as much technology as the 8-ball. And the crystal ball, I left it in my office this morning. I need that. But what I can say is, if companies like Martin, Fender, Gibson, Taylor keep up their quality on PRS, anybody, any company, if they keep up their quality, or if they improve it, if they make better ones 20 years from now, then the ones today may not be as collectible. But if they go out of business, if they change ownership and they lower the quality, then the ones made today could be very collectible years from now. So it depends what's being made 20 years or 30 years or 40 years from now. But since I'll be 77 next month, I don't expect to be in a position to check on the quality of new ones 50 years from now. But I certainly hope that I'll be around 20 years from now. My great uncle Otto lived to be 105, and he never retired, and his sister Emma only made it to 102. I'm having too much fun here to want to retire. All I have to do is come and do fun stuff each day. My stepson Eric is a great company president and general manager. I have a great sales manager. I have a great bookkeeper. I have great management and repair department with Greg and Tony. I have a great staff. I only have to come in and have a good fun time every day. And that's a whole lot more fun than retirement could ever be. So Buddy Black says, hi, George. Has been an interesting week. Hope yours has been too. Following the advice of my friends, I bought an olive drab vintage old stock trainee. They keep telling me I need to get rid of those old used guitars and get a nice new one with a warranty. This was one of 5 commissioned by Chuck Levin. Do you think that special order limited editions like that are good investments? Oh yeah, yesterday I bought a 1967 black Trini Lopez too. As you know, there are less than 2,000 Trini standards from original production. How many custom color ones do you think exist? Well, I don't know that there's good records right now for me to look up to see how many custom colors they made, but it wouldn't be many. Special order limited editions, so far as investment potential, it's hard to just put those as one blanket category. Some things that are custom one of a kinds are often of questionable investment potential. If it was a design that Joe Blow, member of public, ordered a custom guitar to his specs, if nobody else ever ordered something similar, there might not have been enough demand. Yeah, if somebody is a builder and they make something that turns out that it's just fabulous, well, they're going to probably be commercially minded enough that they might make more like that if it's a good seller. If they make something and they produce a limited run of 20 and never make anything like it again, it tells me that they didn't think enough of it, and the public didn't think enough of it either to want to order more like that. So just like custom colors, well, if it's such a rare color that they did one and never made another and nobody else ordered another like it, maybe there wasn't much demand for it then because it was ugly. On the other hand, there are some things that would be very desirable. But in coins, if it's a US mint coin and it's incredibly rare, that brings big bucks. In guitars, if the basic specifications of the model are such, it sounds great, looks great, sounds great, fine. That should be collectible. But it's going to depend on the reputation of the maker and the reputation of instruments from that period in their history, and the basic reputation of the base model that this is a custom version of. A custom version of a model that nobody ever liked may not bring much. It may be very, very rare, but that's like my story about my father, the pathologist, who came home one day and was just happy as could be that he'd diagnosed an extraordinarily rare tumor and was going to get to write a paper about it. And I asked him, well, Dad, that's great, but how's the patient doing? Oh, he's going to die. I said, well, why are you so happy? But well, I just diagnosed it. It's an interesting case, but I didn't cause him to get sick. And we're doing everything we can to help him. And we're also doing research about the disease. But there are some things that may be rare, but not necessarily desirable. I personally don't desire to have an extremely rare malignant tumor. And there are some model guitars I've seen that people came up with as an experimental design and custom ordered that were just plain goofy, and I wouldn't want them. But rarity alone, if it's a postage stamp or a coin, especially even if they make a mistake and it's improperly struck coin where it's not centered properly, or a postage stamp where the airplane was upside down, that brings a lot of extra money. Guitars with errors don't bring extra money, especially if it impacts playability. But coins and postage stamps that are government issued that had a mistake and somehow slipped through and got out into circulation, they bring huge extra money. But again, if it's a really great instrument and it's beautiful and it's an unusual variation of a model that's in great demand, yeah, that can bring extra money. But just simply because it's rare and being one of a kind, that may not be a big deal. Because these days, these companies do a lot of custom orders. Martin has a whole division for that. Fender has a whole division for that. So the fact that a Fender these days is one of a kind That doesn't mean much. They have a whole department turning out one-of-a-kind guitars, whatever somebody orders. The fact that it's one of them doesn't mean much. But if it was made in 1952 and it's an unusual rare variation of a Fender Tele, and it was a really neat custom color and any other special features that actually play well, that might bring real money. But today, being one of a kind, they're cranking out thousands of them. So it's not that big a deal now, but it could be a much bigger deal if you find the right vintage one. But even there, if it's not a custom variation where the base model is desirable, it doesn't amount to much. Rarity alone does not carry the weight in the vintage market or a collectible market as it might for coins and stamps. Larry Harris asks, what are your thoughts on an all mahogany guitar? Well, I don't ever think I've ever seen a completely all mahogany guitar, but as far as top, back, and sides and neck, yes, Martin and Gibson have both done that, but they still would have rosewood bridge and fingerboard, and the braces wouldn't be mahogany inside. But so far as mahogany top, back, sides, and neck, some of the Martins and Gibsons that have that type of construction sound quite good. I personally think they're fine for blues and not so fine if you want a mellow, smooth sound. But if you want a sort of bright but sort of funky blues sound, that can work quite well. But so far as electric guitars, there certainly have been electric guitars made with a solid mahogany body and mahogany neck, but you would still generally have a rosewood or ebony fingerboard. And mahogany can work quite well for an electric guitar. Alan Rourke asks, what year did Les Paul Custom name begin and placed on the headstock? Well, the Les Paul Custom was introduced in late 1953. Excuse me. But again, it was the first ones made were in late 53 and do have 53 serial numbers, but they were not in the catalog until 54. But in those days, of course, there was no internet. Model introductions were often done in the middle of the year at the trade show. The NAMM shows were in Chicago in June. And they would have a catalog printed in advance of the show. So the model design work was done to have it ready for display at the show. The actual introduction and production was sometimes started in advance of the show. There were some models that weren't available until the show, and some models that they would come out with often earlier in the year, but the catalog was frequently not ready until the show. So you will find a number of models, especially with Gibson, that their catalogs didn't necessarily even have a photo or a drawing. Some of them were photos, and some of the catalogs actually were they were actually artwork, but not a real photo. But I've there are numerous Gibson catalogs in which the photo or picture in the catalog is not fully up to date, and it may have shown last year's model. So there were some pictures in Gibson catalogs in the 50s, early 50s, that still show some of the flat top guitars with the old Script logo, but that Script logo was gone in most of the models by the end of 47. So at any rate, the name Les Paul Custom on the truss rod cover was there in late 53, and the model did exist in late 53. And the early Les Paul Custom from late 53 through mid 57 had a P90 pickup in the bridge position, the soap bar black plastic covered P90, and a soap bar type, but with Alnico 5 magnets, and the magnets were height adjustable. So that was the so-called staple pickups. And that was the rhythm pickup also from late 53 through mid 57. And there were quite a few models of Gibson that had P90s and then switched to the staple pickups. Some of those came out also on L5 electrics and Super 400 electrics. And then that switched. So first they had P90s and they had the staple pickup on some of those. And then in mid 57, the ES-175, the L5, the Super 400, and of course the Les Paul standards and the Les Paul customs went to humbucking pickups in mid 57. So quite a bit of change. And let's see if we have some more questions. We do. Steve Greenberg says, hi, George. My main electric guitar is a Brian Moore C90. It's a wonderful instrument that works very well for me, but I don't hear much about them. Do you have any experience or observation on these instruments? I remember them from when they were new. They're not in production now. And they had a variety of models. And he also asks, how would I compare those guitars to the current model PRS electrics? And I would say the Brian Moores were of good quality, but they're so different from a PRS that it would be like comparing Fenders to Gibson electrics and say, how do you think Gibson and Fender electrics compare? They'd be different. The workmanship was good on the Brian Moores. And there were also some Brian Moore acoustic designs that had a pretty weird bridge arrangement. But I don't see them around much anymore. It's been several years since I've even had one offered to me. My experience is that they were not easy to sell when they were new. We didn't have much luck selling them used. They were not bringing Gibson or Fender prices, but they cost Gibson and Fender type prices when new. They had one of his features was a radiused top, which was a curved top, but not a compound radius like a Les Paul. It was a different arch where it was almost like a cylinder, partial cylinder profile that had a different, but it was a radiused top, but it was the same radius going from the front of the body to the back of the body. So it was an interesting guitar. They were good guitars, but there's not much more I can say about it other than my experience was that they were good instruments that were hard to sell for me. and they obviously didn't take off well enough in the market for them to continue. So Bill Comber asks, what is the purpose of the chrome pickup cover on a Fender jazz bass? Well, of course, it's not only on the jazz bass, it was there on the P bass as well. They had bridge covers and pickup covers that were not a cover over the pickup itself. They were a guard that went over it. While they looked sort of neat, and Leo seemed to think that there was a purpose in having them, they served not much different purpose than, for example, the ashtray cover on a Fender Telecaster. And what people do with the ashtray cover on the Fender Telecaster is immediately before playing it, they take that thing off and they either throw it away or put it in the case pocket. And when it's being offered later for sale, people will ask, well, do you have the cover? And people like to have it. They just don't like to use it because it's physically in the way. They look good, but they interfere with playability. And Leo, throughout his career ownership of Fender, insisted on having these covers over pickups on the basses and covers on the bridges. So while the ashtray cover on a Fender Telecaster or Esquire is quite large, on a Stratocaster or Jazzmaster or Jaguar, the cover was much smaller. It was still there, but it was removable. It was not screwed in place. Now the guards on the basses, those cover guards, they were screwed on. So when you took them off, it did leave screw holes. Whereas on the guitars, there was no screw hole. It just pulled right off. So the best thing I can say about the covers is that they were decorative for hanging it on a wall. But the good thing about them for playing is they just pulled off with great ease so that you can actually use the instrument. But if you want to damp the strings with the palm of your hand, you can't do that with a bridge cover on it. And on the basses, those guards are physically in the way, so that skilled players remove them. So I can't think of much good to recommend about them. Tom Goodhue asks, what was the first guitar in your collection? I guess I have a difficult time answering that because I know what my first guitar was, but by definition, having my first guitar wasn't a collection. At what time did it even become a collection? And what is the definition of a collection? If you bought one guitar and it's still your first guitar, and you later have a collection and you still have that guitar, that might well be the first one in your collection. But in my case, my first guitar was one I didn't keep for long. I kept it for less than 1 year. It was a Conde Hermanos Classical made in '59. It was a good guitar, but I quickly discovered it didn't suit my style of playing at all. So I traded it for another guitar. And I got a Gibson Style O artist model with the scroll made about 1915. And I didn't keep that one terribly long, but I kept that at least for several years. My third guitar was a 1930s Martin F7 archtop. My fourth guitar was a Gibson L5 signed by Lloyd Loar in 1924. And I kept that one for over 20 years. And that's the one that really, more than anything, inspired me to be a collector. And from the time I got that one onward, I had then a passion to actually collect guitars. Before that, I was just looking for a really nice guitar that I would like to own and keep, but I just wasn't finding the right one that really clicked with me. But that one did. And from there onward, I was a collector. But what's the first one in your collection? It may not be your first guitar. But if you retained it and kept it, and then the other thing to say is if you're just simply buying and flipping them, you're a speculator, maybe a dealer and speculator, but you're not a collector. So what's the first one in your collection? The collection has to be a collection, which means that it's not just an accumulation of dealing stock. It's something that has a theme to it. It may be the history of Martin or Gibson or Fender, or it may just be the history and showing the evolution of the Les Paul and having examples of each model from a period of time. It may be just what Gibson made in a certain decade, but there ought to be some kind of a theme to it, a bit of a pattern to it, rather than just a random assortment of, just if you're a plumber and you got a whole bunch of wrenches, that doesn't mean you're a collector of tools. But if you're collecting special vintage tools and you're showing the evolution of wrenches, some of those old tools are worth a lot of money and are historically very interesting. And you may be buying them because as a museum piece, it shows you, here's the first known example of a monkey wrench. And that can be a collection. But simply because you're a plumber and you got a bunch of wrenches and screwdrivers, that doesn't mean you're a collector. It means you're using them. And you can be a studio guitar player and have a dozen guitars that you use because you need to have a classical, you need to have a steel string flat top, you need to have a arch top acoustic, you need to have a solid body Fender and a solid body Gibson, and you may want to have a semi-hollow or hollow body electric. So that's not a collection. That's your arsenal of weaponry that you're using when you go to the studio, what you need. But at any rate, that's how I define it. Kevin Doherty asks, I own a Martin HD 28E Retro Centennial made in 2016. Don't plan to sell it, but is it valued more today than the $36.59 price I paid new? The answer is it's probably held its value pretty well, but isn't necessarily up. What it's going to do in the next decade or two, my 8-ball just isn't functioning. So next week, I'll just have the crystal ball in here because I can't even read the 8-ball. Going to have to get me a new one. It's illegible. Something's happened to it. Never seen that before on an 8-ball, but it doesn't want to answer anything today. But most instruments that you would buy new in 2016 are not worth more now than you paid then. It might be that if you ordered a new equivalent one, it would cost a bit more, but I wouldn't count on the resale value of a used one that you bought new in 1916 to be up from what you paid then. But what it's going to do in the coming decade, that I cannot answer. David Gartland says regarding the 3 custom guitars, the 2 by John Graven and the Henderson, he says those 3 guitars are fantastic and all have somewhat unique features. My question is, when commissioning a custom guitar through a luthier, can it be like building hot rods, for example, when being too custom might be expensive, but not necessarily collectible? Designs are important. I'm sure the choice of maker holds a lot of the value, as you showed in your examples today. And yes, who made it counts. A custom guitar ordered from a famous luthier is likely to be much more saleable and marketable in the future than one built by a small-time, more amateurish builder. So that does matter. And if you order things that nobody else has ever ordered before because nobody else ever wanted one like that before and maybe never will again, that may not do well. So it depends who made it and what the specs are. And just because something is one of a kind made to you, if it's too much for you only, such that it's like a bespoke suit of clothing where it fits you and nobody else, that's hard to sell. But at least guitars are not quite like custom tailored clothing. Most people can pick up a guitar and play it where the dimensions are probably not going to be so weird that nobody else would want it. But if you're one of the basketball players who's 7 feet 5 inches tall and you have a guitar built so that it fits your hand and your fingers come out to here, so you got this giant hand that could pick up a basketball and hold it like I would hold a softball, the guitar neck that is custom tailored to your hand, and it may not work for most other people, but most guitars, the dimensions are at least ergonomically playable for others so that it's not quite like a custom tailored piece of clothing. But again, if the specs suit nobody but you and nobody else ever asked for one or is likely to, again, don't count on rarity alone making it valuable. And Henry Wynn asks, what was your opinion of the Martin Ditson reissues? They were very good guitars. And they were reissues of guitars that actually made sense and were historically important in that they were the foundation for what followed on some very successful models. And they are good guitars. Did Guild come out with the first cutaway acoustic, the D40C? Seems like I read that, but can't confirm. My answer to that is no, Guild didn't come out with the first cutaway acoustic because Epiphone was doing flat top cutaway guitars, such as they made several, but they made a cutaway deluxe. It's a flat top. They were using the same body form as some of their arch top acoustic cutaways, but they were doing that as early as about 1950, which would be before the Guild Company made anything. So in fact, Guild started out, they made their in 53, but they hired that was Alfred Drange, started that in New York, and some of his earliest employees were people who had been laid off when Epiphone moved out of New York and went to Philadelphia, and then shortly thereafter they folded. They got bought by CMI, the parent company of Gibson at the time. But the earliest flat top cutaway guitars that I can recall would be those made by Epiphone, not by Guild. Gary Doyle says, I still have my 19 Gibson A natural finish top mandolin you appraised for me back in the 1970s, just wondering what it's worth today. In great shape, still plays and sounds great. Well, it depends a lot on condition structurally and cosmetically, but obviously that's something that's worth a lot more today than it was in the 1970s. But in 1918, that was Gibson's student model mandolin, but it was still good quality with a carved top and carved back, birch back and sides, spruce top. And one of those in fine condition is still going to, right now, be under $2,000, but at least beginning to push toward that amount, which is a heck of a lot more than we would have appraised it for during the 70s when prices were much cheaper. Uh, Michael Callie asks about James Olson. Is he still producing his guitars? And at this point, he asks, is he too semi-retired? Well, he is semi-retired, so he's not actively building much. And does he have an apprentice luthier? The answer is, I don't know, but this is a question I just got. This should not be something hard to research. It's one thing about Olson is he ain't dead yet. You can contact him and just ask him. So some questions, while I may not know the answer immediately, we know how to research it. It may be a long distance call to call him, but these days long distance calls are free. Email is free, but most plans on cell phone, you can call all over the country and some all over the world. And this is an easy question to answer, although I don't have the answer instantly. But you yourself can research that one in a hurry. Darren Lewis King asks, can you discuss Stratocaster body woods and how different woods impact tone and sustain? Well, early Strats had ash bodies for the very earliest ones, and then by the at least by 56 or so, they were going to alder, and there's a subtle difference in sound, but it also depends so much on not only the species, but the growing condition of the wood. Like you can get ash that varies tremendously in weight per cubic volume, and even where it's grown and what the soil content, mineral content was. So the answer is that in addition to the wood, the bridges, what they made, the bridge saddle design changed over the years. There's so many factors, plus the pickups themselves. Ash and alder both can give excellent sound for a Stratocaster. And when that's coupled with good neck design, good bridge design, good pickup design, either one can give you an excellent result. And the differences in sound between ash and alder used on Stratocasters is not irrelevant, but simply pretty subtle in difference, to the point that either one can give an extremely good sound for that design guitar. John Parsons has a question. Do you have any opinion on the original design electric guitars made for Aria Pro 2 at the Matsumoto factory back in the late 70s and early 80s? And there were lots of different Aria models. They are not all the same in quality. These guitars were not made by Aria Pro 2. They were made for that brand name. Aria was Shiro Arai. Shiro Arai did not own a guitar factory. He had guitars made to his specs. Shiro Arai himself was actually more interested in classical guitars. I met him on quite a number of occasions at trade shows, both in Japan and in the US. And he was an interesting and very knowledgeable guy. And he was very much into guitars, but again, his personal interests were more in classical guitars, but his business interests were such that he was diversified, and he was marketing guitars in Japan and in the USA. And some of the ones marketed in Japan were more expensive than the ones being marketed in the USA, because the USA distributors simply didn't want to pay the price that some of the higher grade Japanese guitars cost, even as far back as in 1974. When I visited Japan, they were making guitars for the Japanese domestic market that were relatively expensive even over there, but you have to figure the cost of land, even in the 70s in Japan, was more than per acre here. The cost of wood was more because they didn't cut their own trees. They cut trees elsewhere, and that meant they were buying from the same places that American makers were. The cost of labor was cheaper in Japan in 74 than it was in the USA, whereas today it's fully equivalent. But back then, labor was cheaper, but everything else cost more. So it really wasn't cheap to make a guitar in Japan in 1974. I had an interesting conversation back then with Tak Inoue, who was the export director for Morris Guitars, Mori Daidagaki, and he told me that they had approached Fender and showed them some designs, Fender Telecaster and Strat type guitars that they showed to Fender, saying, you know, you guys could use this and we could supply it, and you could have an import line that you could sell, you know, for a secondary market that is less money than the American-made Fenders. And the response that they got from Fender at that time was that Fender told them that, well, those are nice guitars, but you may not realize it, but our cost to make a real Telecaster in Fullerton, California, is actually less than you just quoted us to make a copy, but we don't need those. Anyway, we've covered a good bit of ground today. I have responded to the questions given to me today. There was one question from last week that I didn't answer, and that was a person who wanted to know about if I would be interested in consigning guitars. And I didn't answer it online, and I found to my chagrin that I wasn't able to come up with an address to respond to him. But if anybody has guitars that they want to sell or consign, of course we do that. And I'm easy to reach. We're always interested in acquiring good guitars because you can't sell guitars if you don't either buy them, trade for them, or consign them. So yes, of course, if you have guitars of any quality that you wish to sell, trade, or consign, I'm interested. You can talk to me direct. My email address is george@guitars.com. The phone number here is 615-256-2033. I'm here 6 days a week, Monday through Saturday. We're closed on Sundays. I email daily, so the emails come straight through to my computer and my phone. I do personally read emails that come to that address, george@guitars.com. If you call the store, you can talk to me or any of our sales staff. We are always interested in doing business. And I personally come here 6 days a week, even after 52 years and almost 8 months, because I like it here. I enjoy being here. I like what I'm doing. I have a great staff, and we are here to help you. And I am firm believers that the golden rule is the best rule in personal conduct and in business. We want to treat people as though the way we want to be treated ourselves. If we go into an establishment, we want to get good service, and we want to give the same kind of service to you that we ourselves would like to receive when we go somewhere shopping, either online, on the phone, or in person. So by all means, feel free to contact us. We are here to help you. Till next week, have a good one. We look forward to talking with you next Friday.